Okay, welcome everyone to the 67th meeting of New Directions in Group Theory and Triangulated Categories. Today our speaker is Patrick Lank from the University of South Carolina, and the title of his talk is How Frobenius Pushforwards Generate the Bounded Derived Category.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks for this opportunity. So everything I say today is joint work with Matthew Ballard, Srikanth B, Iyengar, Alapan Mukhopadhyay, and Josh Pollitz. So I assume we know what a triangulated category is, and I'm going to probably say some things that might be already known, but I just want to make sure I at least cover my tracks for some of the background information. Let T be a triangulated category. We say full subcategory S and T is thick when it's closed under direct summands, shifts, and combs. Given any full subcategory, we can consider the smallest thick subcategory which contains it. And we denote this by a thick of S. You can take the intersection of all thick subcategories that contain it, and this will give us the smallest thick. If S consists of a single object, G, for instance, instead of denoting this as thick S, we'll just denote this as by thick G. Oftentimes, when we're considering thick subcategories in our purposes, we might only be considering a single object as opposed to a full subcategory. Now, some of these definitions might apply to full subcategories, but we're going to be interested particularly in objects. So if I take an object G inside my triangulated category T, and if the smallest thick subcategory of G is all of T, we say G is a classical generator. Two examples that we may or may not know. If you take K to be a field, then the smallest thick subcategory containing K is all dB mod K. Again, the dB mod or dB co I'll be describing in a second. If I have a polynomial ring over a field, the smallest thick subcategory containing the polynomial ring is dB mod R. Again, I'm going to describe this notation in just a sec, but just to give you two examples to think about. There are other examples where classical generators come into. The primary interest today is going to be for noetherian schemes. There's other contexts to which generation is thought about as well. Okay, so for some notation. Let X be a noetherian scheme. Denote by D of X the derived category of complexes of quasi-coherent cohomology. Denote dB co-X as the derived category of bounded complexes with coherent cohomology. And perfects the full subcategory consisting of perfect complexes. Now, D of X is unbounded, where dB co-X has bounded cohomology. So as we just saw, given a triangulated category, given a full subcategory or just an object, we can consider the smallest thick subcategory which contains it. Now, what I'm about to write or show can be applied to triangulated categories, but for our case, we're focusing primarily on noetherian schemes and the bound derived category. So if I take an object G inside dB co-X, we can inductively define the following full subcategories. Instead of NT, it should say dB co-X. So we define thick 0 of G just to be 0, or things that are acyclic. We define thick 1 to consist of all objects that are direct summands of complexes of the form that are direct sums of, direct sums of shifts of direct sums of the object G. So here, the differential will be 0. You're just looking at direct summands of things can be attained by taking direct sums of shifts of your object. Thick N consists of all objects that are direct summands of a complex which appears in a distinguished triangle, where the remaining two, one belongs in thick N minus 1, and the other one belongs inside thick 1. In some sense, you're looking at extensions, some objects that are direct summands that can be attained as at least up to summands and shifts of extensions from things on the previous step and those that lie inside thick 1. Again, this might be known. I just want to kind of backtrack. This idea of the thick subcategory allows us, in this filtration, allows us to actually have a decomposition. So you take any object, you look at the smallest thick subcategory, and we can decompose it in the sense that this inductively defined full subcategories give me a way to kind of build up the objects in the small six subcategory in a way that actually kind of keeps track of the number of cones, shifts, indirect summons. So if I take thick n, all that are defined, and I look at their union, that's going to be equal to the small six subcategory of my object. Again, this n is keeping track of the number of cones, shifts, and direct summands, in some sense, to kind of build your objects, which is what we're getting to. Any questions so far? Okay. So given that we have a decomposition for the small six subcategory, if I choose any object inside thick G, well, I can find the smallest n for which E is inside thick n of G. The smallest such n is called the level of G with respect to E, and we denote this as this level sub G, level sub G of E. So for two examples, again, this level is keeping track of the number of cones, direct summands, and shifts, in some sense, to build E from G. So you have these operations in the triangulated category: shifts, direct summands, and cones. Using this decomposition for thick, you can keep track of the number of combinations of these rules, in some sense, to get your object E, at least up to direct sums and shifts. So two examples: if you take a local Artinian ring R with residue field K, if I let E be inside dB mod R, then the level of E with respect to K is less than or equal to the Lowy length of R. If I have a regular noetherian finite dimensional ring, then for every object, the level of R with respect to E is at most the curl dimension plus 1. And there's other examples where we actually can compute the level. And this is a problem of interest. It says, all right, if I have an object that's a classical generator, and I know I can, in some sense, the smallest six subcategory is the whole ambient space, and I have this decomposition, can I compute the level with respect to an object? And that's a problem. It's a very computational question to ask. So if I have a classical generator, I say it's strong when there exists an n, such that thick n of G is all with dB cox. If this property holds and n is the smallest value, we say this generation time is n minus 1. So what this is saying is, classical generator says, all right, smallest thick is the whole space. A strong generator says, not only is the small six subcategory the whole space, but I actually have a uniform bound on the number of steps using to build any object, using direct summands, cones, and shifts. So a strong generator is actually a very nice property to have in the derived category. It says you can build objects, and not only know you can build objects from a single one, but you have a uniform number of steps, and you can actually keep track of it. And that poses another computational problem. Given a strong generator, what is its generation time? And in what instances do we know we actually can compute them? These are problems that people study. Again, a lot of things that I've just described can be just done in an arbitrary triangulated category, but for our purposes, I'm focusing primarily on the geometric setting, or at least on the scheme theoretic setting. So what we're saying here is going to be for dB cox. Okay, so if you've seen this, great. If you haven't seen it, we can have a running example to kind of see where these ideas are coming into play and how they're going to be used. Let R be a noetherian regular local ring of finite curl dimension D. I claim that thick D plus 1 of R is all of dB mod R. What this says is that R is a strong generator whose generation time is the curl dimension. So it says I could build any object and at most D plus 1 steps using direct summands, cones, and shifts. So if you take any complex, a bounded complex, we have a distinguished triangle, ZE to E to BE shifted by 1, and you extend it. Where ZE and BE are respectively the complexes of cycles and boundaries. This is a standard thing. But what's nice is that ZE and BE are complexes that have 0 differentials. So what this means is that it's just a direct sum of shifts of finally generated R modules. So bounded complexes of the following form. where you have finitely generated modules and at finitely many component or degrees, and you have the zero differential, at least up to quasi-isomorphism. So what this says is, all right, I can realize E as an object that's built from ZE and BE shifted by 1. Again, when I'm generating an object, you don't really care about the shifts in some sense. You're just generating objects up to direct sums and shifts. So if we can show that R builds every finitely generated R module, then we can build ZE and BE. And hence, I can generate the object E from R. So they reduce the problem to saying, all right, well, let's just assume my complex now is just a module. Now the question is, can I build that module from R? Well, my assumption was R is regular. So it tells me the projective dimension of my module is at most the curl dimension. So I can take a finite free resolution of M and have the following sequence, where this object is going to be the finite free resolution of M. Okay, so if I write P for the complex, which is the finite free resolution, where I remove R, P is quasi-isomorphic to M. But what's nice is this object is just an object that's built from R by taking iterated cones. So because M is quasi-isomorphic to P, and I know P can be generated by R using iterated cones, then I can build M from R by, in the sense, I can just build its projective resolution, or I place with the projective resolution, I can build it. And with a little bit more work and with a little bit more time, then you can actually show the generation time would actually be the curl dimension, at most the curl dimension, if you want to say not only for modules, but for full bounded complexes. In this example, yeah, local, cool. I want to make sure that was a local ring. So again, the strategy is you have an object, if its small fixed subcategory is the bounded derived category, you can build objects in finitely many steps using cones, direct summands, and shifts. Sometimes you can have a uniform bounds on the number of steps to build any object. In the case where regular, the idea was, well, we can take a bounded complex, reduce the problem to generating just a module, and then use something I know about the ring to say how I can generate the module. In this case, being regular means find a projective dimension, and then you can just argue that way. So a lot of the times, the generation reflects some kind of property, or maybe you can think of property of the derived category and how it relates to generation are things that will help you kind of think about the problem, these computational questions. Any questions so far? No? Okay. Some other examples. Take K to be a strong generator. So K, the residue field, is a strong generator for a local Artinian ring. As we just saw, we have a regular noetherian ring. If it's local, it's a strong generator, but you can also do this for removing the local assumption. If you want a singular example, if you take a monomial ideal and a polynomial ring over a field, look at its quotient ring, the direct sum of the quotients over the minimal primes is also an instance of a strong generator. The generation times in these examples are also known. I didn't write it down, but I mean, I could tell you. But the idea is that, all right, if you have a strong generator, can actually compute the generation time. So we have two computational problems. What rings have classical generators? Which ones have strong generators? And those that do, can you actually compute the generation time? And also, maybe does this tell me something about the ring that I didn't know before? In the geometric setting, we have a very nice result by Orlov. Let X be a quasi-projective variety or a field. If I take a very ample line bundle L, the direct sum of the tensor powers of L, ranging from 0 to the dimension, is a classical generator for all perfect complexes. So what this says is that thick of this direct sum is exactly perfect complexes. If I assume that X is smooth, this actually turns out to be a strong generator for DB cox. In fact, when you're regular, everything's perfect. So in some sense, being a classical generator for perf X when I'm regular is simply as being a classical generator for the bound derived category. But being strong, pun intended, is a strong condition. It says that I can build the objects in a uniform number of steps. And in some sense, this strong generator for something that's smooth, computing the generation time in a non-affine setting is actually kind of difficult. And that is a very interesting problem that people have been working on. Also, this is a very important example to keep in mind because later we're going to see, all right, quasi-projective varieties, perfect complexes have a natural choice for a classical generator. We're going to see how to, in some sense, translate this classical generator for perfect complexes into a strong generator for the bound derived category in the singular setting without assuming X is smooth or anything of that sort. So some natural questions. What schemes satisfy the property where DB cox emits strong generators? In the case it does, what exactly does this tell us about X or about the scheme? Can I extract information from the derived category to tell me something either algebraic, geometric, or homological about the scheme or the ring or whatever I'm working with? So as some might know, in general, it can be hard to explicitly write out what a strong generator actually looks like. If I give you a ring, if I give you a scheme, can you write it out? And sometimes it's kind of hard to do. But we at least know of their existence for a general class of schemes. So this work has been done by Neiman. There's just many people that have been working on this. And I know if I say the list of names, it's not going to be comprehensive enough. But a recent result by Aoki says for a nice class of schemes, we actually know that strong generators exist. So if I have a finite dimensional, quasi-excellent noetherian separated scheme, then DB cox emits strong generators. Most geometric examples, for instance, varieties and such, satisfy these types of properties. Quasi-excellence is a very general situation to be in, but we at least know that these schemes will have strong generators. So the next question is, well, what do they look like? How do I actually write them down? And that's where we end up coming in. So our problem was to think about this problem of strong generation in the context of prime characteristic. So we say a noetherian scheme, a prime characteristic P, is F finite when the Frobenius morphism is a finite map. Recall that the Frobenius morphism on sections just raises things to P powers. Easy examples is take a noetherian scheme that's essentially a finite type over a perfect field of prime characteristic. This would be a nice running example for a scheme that is F finite. Again, it just means that the Frobenius morphism is a finite map. This finiteness, though, ends up giving one a lot of properties to study and actually utilize. There's been a lot of work in commutative algebra and a little bit of birational geometry where this F finiteness allows you to either understand something about the singularity type or understand something about the scheme at a homological level, and there's a whole body of work that's been done. So the question was, well, does F finiteness have anything to say in derived categories or have anything to say at the level of derived categories? And we're going to kind of use this. Okay, so the main result of our work is we can say something about strong generators in the context of prime characteristic. So if I have a noetherian F finite separated scheme, and if I have any bounded complex with coherent cohomology, G, and if G generates all perfect complexes, then I can push forward G sufficiently many times to obtain a strong generator. So for instance, if I have G is inside perf X such that perf X is actually thick of G, then what this says is that I can push forward sufficiently many times this object by the Frobenius And this gives me a strong generator for dB cox. So you're taking something that's a perfect complex, and for instance, something with full support, and it generates all perfect complexes. And what you're saying is I can actually, all right, I know it's not going to build the whole boundary category, but I can apply the Frobenius morphism, assume that the Frobenius morphism is a finite map, and somehow iterating this endo functor, this endomorphism, sufficiently many times, all of a sudden a strong generator appears out of nowhere. It's a very interesting property. This assumption of F finiteness, just the Frobenius being a finite map, allows you to take something that doesn't generate and allows you to produce something that becomes not only a classical generator, but it's a strong generator. So it also shows we know strong generators exist, but now we can actually explicitly write it out in some sense. So return back to the example that Orlov had given us. Take a quasi projective variety over a field of prime characteristic. Let L be a very ample line bundle. We know that the direct sum of the tensor powers of L from 0 to the dimension is a classical generator for perfect complexes. Well, I can take our result, apply the Frobenius pushforward sufficiently many times, and all of a sudden I have a strong generator for this variety. So in some sense, what we're saying is thick of the pushforward on this direct sum is all of dB cox. So before, we just knew that this object was an object that generated all perfect complexes. And it surely does not always generate all of dB cox when we're singular, for instance. However, I can push forward by Frobenius enough times, and this gives us a strong generator. So it's taking something that we knew to behave very well in the smooth setting, and this F finiteness allows us to kind of extend a result into the singular setting. And it says that, well, we can actually write down explicitly a strong generator for these varieties. Any questions so far? No? Okay. Cool, so this is good. If I have a noetherian F finite separated scheme, and if I have any bounded complex that generates all perfect complexes, I know I could push forward sufficiently many times to get a strong generator. The natural question is, well, how many push forwards do I need to generate? Is there some number that I can just say, oh, if I push forward blah times, I know I'm guaranteed to generate. It's a sufficiently many it's a nice result, but it'd be better if we had a way to kind of get a grip on the number of iterates needed. Well, we can. And we will introduce this invariant called the codepth. So given a local noetherian ring, we define its codepth to be the embedding dimension minus the, I'm so sorry, this should be depth. Minus its depth. The embedding dimension is the minimal number of generators needed for the maximal ideal. Given a noetherian scheme, we define its codepth to be the supremum of codepths on its stalks. Now, it's not clear that the codepth is always finite. And it's not clear that this value will be finite in maybe all cases that we would ever care about with this F finiteness. So the codepth is just the embedding dimension minus the depth when you're local. And if I'm a noetherian scheme, it's the supremum of the codepth on all the stalks. Well, it turns out when you're F finite, once again, we get some nice properties. So the codepth for an F finite noetherian scheme is finite. And if I'm F finite separated with prime characteristic P, then that tells me I can actually push forward E times to get a strong generator where P to the E is bigger than the codepth. So in some sense, when P to E is bigger than the codepth of X, F finiteness gives us that this value is finite. This tells us that thick of my object that generates all perfect complexes gives me a strong generator. So this codepth and the characteristic that I'm working in in some sense, governs an upper bound on the number of iterates needed to generate or to produce a strong generator, which is interesting because it says, all right, if I know the characteristic of the scheme and I can actually compute its codepth, then I can produce an upper bound on the number of iterates needed to push forward and obtain a strong generator. Question is, how sharp is it? Question is this always this value? Can I actually iterate in fewer times and produce a strong generator? And these types of questions are things that we've studied a little bit. As a quick corollary, if I'm affine, well, it turns out I can actually just push forward the ring sufficiently many times to produce a strong generator for dB mod R. And again, if I'm prime characteristic P, if P to the E is bigger than the codepth, then we know that the ETH push forward of R will strongly generate. Well, why is because perf R is precisely thick R. And that's enough. That's all the information we need. We just says, all right, I have an object, generates all perfect complexes. Let's push it forward sufficient many times. It generates all dB mod R. The codepth and the characteristic govern an upper bound. We don't know how sharp it is, but it gives us a number that we can actually work with to say I can push forward this many times and I can have a strong generator. So in the following examples, we know that we only need to push forward once to generate. Now, there might be examples where you need to push forward more times, but we know for certain that I don't really care about the codepth and I don't care about the characteristic in these situations. I know that I could push forward once, and that's very nice to know. So if I'm regular noetherian, finite curl dimension, I push forward once. Stanley-Rising rings, locally complete intersection rings, Veronese, subrings in the affine plane, various examples of monomial algebras. There's Artinian rings that we've computed out. In a global situation, if I'm noetherian, F-finite, and I'm locally complete intersection scheme, meaning all my stocks are local complete intersections, you can take any object that generates perfect complex and just push forward once. And I'll explain a little bit more on this this LCI situation in a little bit. Any questions so far? No? Okay. Cool. So we have in some sense, a way to explicitly write out a strong generator, for instance, with quasi-projective varieties, or at least a way to produce strong generators. When we knew that they exist, and now we can say, at least in the F-finite setting, there's a way to actually produce them. There's a way to actually explicitly write out a strong generator. So let's study some applications of this generation result. So let X be a noetherian F-finite scheme. Well, I know, viewing X as spec of R, I can push forward the structure sheaf and always produce a strong generator by using the Frobenius morphism. However, the natural question is, what happens in the global situation? What happens if, for instance, I'm working on a predictive variety, and can I push forward the structure sheaf? And does this give me a strong generator? Because I know I need to generate perfect complexes. Well, OX doesn't generate all perfect complexes, for instance, for the predictive varieties. But can I push it forward to get a strong generator? So let's take an example. Let's look at an F-finite field again. Just think a perfect field, prime characteristic. Let's look at projective n space. So let's recall Ballard's collection. It's OX negative n to OX negative 1 and OX. Their direct sum strongly generates dB cox. This is technically a full exceptional collection, but for our purposes, we'll just say I have this direct sum of twists of a line bundle, and this is a strong generator for dB cox, where X is a projective space over a perfect field of prime characteristic. Well, when P to the E, so P is the characteristic of the base field, when P to the E is larger than N, we have the following decomposition of the ETH push forward on OX. In particular, it's the direct sum of these line bundles appearing in Ballard's collection. The multiplicity of each is positive, but I at least attain one copy for each twist appearing in Bailson's collection. Well, I know that Bailson's collection generates, so that tells me that this generates dB cox. So when p to the e is bigger than n, this tells us that f to the e ox generates dB cox. Again, when x is the projective space. On the other hand, when p to the e is less than or equal to n, turns out that this ETH push forward does not build ox, the first twist of the structure sheet, which tells me I can't generate. So when p to the e is less than or equal to n, this says f to the eox doesn't generate. So let's think about this for a second. The codepth for something that is regular is 0. Codepth in some sense measures the failure to be smooth, or failure to be regular, rather. Well, projective space is smooth, so its codepth is 0. However, here I'm actually producing an example where if I'm in n projective space and my base field is prime characteristic p, there's a relation between p and n that says when can I generate with the ETH push forward on the structure sheaf and when can I not. And this value can actually be chosen to be arbitrary in some sense. And this value is not related to codepth in any kind of way. So what it says is, all right, affine setting, I can push forward the structure sheaf and generate. I can push forward the structure sheaf for projective space and generate. Well, can I do this for other things? Not quite, which I'll get to in a sec. So if I take a noetherian F-finite scheme, I say that it's F-thick when I can push forward the structure sheaf sufficient many times by the Frobenius morphism and produce a classical generator. Now we could say maybe strong generator, but let's just be general as possible and say, if I have a noetherian F-finite scheme, we say it's F-thick when you can push forward the structure sheaf to obtain this classical generator. Not strong, but just classical. Let's just worry about that for now. As we saw, projective space is F-thick. Everything that's affine is F-thick. One idea is, well, what other geometric types of scheme or objects that we care about are F-thick? Well, there's the following examples. Most of this work, if not all of it, is actually things that have been previously studied in the literature. People have been asking questions about pushing forward the structure sheaf on OX to either generate, produce a tilting generator, how does it decompose, so on and so forth. And currently the list that is known is if I have a semi-simple algebraic group over K with Cox number H, and when P is bigger than H, we can produce its F-thick. Flag varieties of type A2 or B2 and an assumption on the characteristic of the base field tell me whether or not I'm going to be F-thick. If I blow up P2 at 4 or less points and I take P to the E, I mean, really just P large, I'm F-thick. Grassmannians, when P is bigger than or equal to N, or when N is equal to 4 and P is bigger than 3. This was a recent paper a couple years ago. And then if I take a smooth quadric and Pn plus 1, and if there's a inequality that's satisfied between N and P, that's also F-thick. This one is not sharp. This is just really it's just saying, all right, I have some results and you can understand how this push forward will decompose. And you can use this information to say, all right, I can generate because I know something else. It doesn't completely say the whole story for quadrics, but you can at least produce examples of quadrics with some assumptions between its degree and the prime characteristic you're working with. If I'm over a non-closed field, you could take Severi-Brouwer varieties, and recently torque varieties have also been shown to be F-thick as well. So again, this list is really what's been studied in the literature. It's been using for examples that other people have been studying about the push forward on the structure sheaf. And their questions might be about generation or tilting generator or how does it decompose, but you can at least say that this F thickness is a natural question. It's a natural thing that people have been working on and studying. And maybe it's a interesting thing to kind of actually look at at the global situation or global setting. So we have some counterexamples to F thickness, which is nice because if you have a definition for something, you would kind of hope that that definition doesn't apply to everything, right? So some counterexamples to F thickness are smooth projected curves of non-zero genus, ruled surfaces over such curves, and abelian varieties. So these gives us some nice concrete examples of varieties that are not F thick. So the next question is, all right, cool. So I have a class of varieties that we're calling F thick. Well, does F thickness tell me anything about their singularity type? Does F thickness tell me anything about anything geometric or algebraically that I didn't know before? And these are natural questions that are worthwhile to study because this F thickness, in some sense, gives you a nice, simple generator. Just push forward the structure sheaf, and now you can say, what does it tell me? Well, we can say something about cohomology at least. So if I have an F thick smooth projective variety, then there exists an n big equal to 0, such that for any line bundle, the nth tensor of L emits non-vanishing cohomology. So that is H star, in case I didn't say this, H star you could just take to be the direct sum of all cohomologies. What this says is that if I'm F thick, smooth projective, I actually can have a statement that says something about non-vanishing cohomology. That's interesting because it actually, you can say this for not only for line bundles, but vector bundles or other objects. But this idea is that F thickness has something to do with non-vanishing for cohomology. And that's something that maybe should be studied a little bit more in the future. Okay, now we can study another application for the strong generation result. So geometrically, you can introduce this notion of F thickness, and we could produce an example of varieties that are F thick and those that are not. And we can already see that there's non-vanishing cohomology conditions. And now we're going to study another application, is the fact that in the affine setting, I can push forward the ring and produce a strong generator. Can this tell me anything about the singularity type of the ring, or does this tell me anything homologically that I might have not known before? Perhaps it provides a new perspective on how to think about things that we already did prior. So this F finite business goes back probably into the 80s, at least. And people have been studying this. This topic is called F singularities. People study the Frobenius morphism in a very homological setting for rings. And there's something called Frobenius splitting. So we say that a ring is Frobenius split when for each E, the Frobenius map splits in the category of modules. Some examples are polynomial rings. If I take a finite group acting on a polynomial ring, where the order of the group and the characteristic of the base field are coprime. And you can look at a polynomial ring in 3 variables, where I mod out by xc minus y squared. F splitting is a singularity type that can be extracted from the Frobenius. There's things called strongly F regular, F rational, so on and so forth. And there's actually deep, meaningful connections to singularities that people study in birational geometry. But for right now, we'll just focus on this Frobenius split. All right, Frobenius split says the Frobenius map, when I look at the restriction of scalars, it splits in the category of modules. Can I somehow use my result saying I can push forward R sufficiently times by Frobenius and produce a strong generator? Can it tell me anything about Frobenius splitting, for instance? And it can. So a noetherian F finite ring is Frobenius split if for some E large, the level of the E push forward on R with respect to in R is 1. What this says is that R is inside thick 1 of F E star R. Again, what does this mean? Well, R is a direct summand of an object of the form of just direct sums of my object and shifts. This doesn't say anything about Frobenius splitting directly. Frobenius splitting says I have a specific map that splits. What I'm saying here is that's equivalent to saying R is inside thick 1 of my object. Well, you can argue this and actually realize that Frobenius splitting is equivalent to this condition where with level of R with respect to the eth push forward being 1. And it gives you a weaker, or it gives you a different perspective to think about Frobenius splitting. You could take Frobenius splitting, a condition that our map splits, and view it as a condition about generating an object in one step in the bound derived category. It's a new perspective. It's something a little bit richer, perhaps, depending on the context you're working in, of course. So, as it says, we can characterize F splitting in terms of a statement about generation in the derived category, and the values of the level of R with respect to the eth push forward measure the deviation of R to being F split, and that motivates the following. So we say the Frobenius level, or F level of R, is the minimum of the level of R with respect to the eth push forward, where I let the iterate of E just range over all values, 1, 2, 3, all up to infinity. The idea is that F level, of R equal 1 is the same thing as being R being F split, which is interesting because in some sense, this measures the failure for the ring to be F split. Now the question is, well, can I produce some bounds? I know it's finite. Now can I actually produce some bounds to actually measure that failure in some sense? We're going to do this for LCIs, or local complete intersections. So I say a local noetherian ring, R, is a local complete intersection, or LCI, when its M-adic completion is isomorphic to S mod I, where S is a regular local ring, and I is an ideal generated by a regular sequence. More generally, we say a noetherian ring is a local complete intersection when every localization at a prime is an LCI. Some examples are take a polynomial ring in 3 variables, mod out by an irreducible, or you could take polynomial ring 3 variables and say x to the n, y to the n, z to the n, and then you can have some fun playing with some examples of this. For LCIs, we actually can produce a upper bounds for the F level in terms of the characteristic and once again, the codepth. So if you take R to be a noetherian F finite ring, a prime characteristic P, we say that it is local. So if it's a local complete intersection, then the F level of R is at most P to the codepth of R. So this says is, all right, if I'm F split, well, F level is 1. Once take an LCI that is not F split, well, I know that the F level is finite. Can I somehow produce a bound on it? And for LCIs, we can. It's going to be P times P raised to the codepth of R. Now, this bound might not be the sharpest if codepth is really large or P is really large, but in some sense, it kind of shows a relationship once again. This assumption of being F finite allows you to produce bounds on invariants in terms of the characteristic and the codepth, and maybe in terms of other invariants, perhaps, in the future. Any questions so far? How much time do I have left? Roughly 7 minutes, 8 minutes, is that right?
Yeah, maybe, yeah, should be more than 6. But yeah, let's say, I mean, yeah, take however long you want. Should be fine.
Okay. Okay, so just to recap so far, what we have is we have a result about generation in the prime characteristic case. It says if I have an object that generates perfect complexes, I can push it forward sufficient many times by Frobenius, and I can produce a classical generator. When X is separated, this is actually a strong generator. That just comes from invoking Aoki. Now there's 2 applications of this. We can ask for what varieties can I push forward the structure sheaf to produce a strong generator? And we saw that this produces non-vanishing cohomology conditions. When I'm affine, I can also use this to detect Frobenius splitting. And we've already seen these are 2 interesting applications of the generation result. In the global setting, we have this F thickness, and the affine setting, we can detect certain kinds of F singularities. Well, next question is, there's a lot of computational parts to this that we want to investigate or look at. So with the time remaining, I want to give a rough sketch of the proof for the generation. How much of this I can get through, I don't know, because I don't want to I don't want to take over too much time, but at least we'll walk through a rough idea. So to outline the strategy, let's just first start with some observations. The derived tensor product on the unbounded derived category gives a structure of a rigidly compactly generated triangulated category. Rigidly compactly generated means I'm compactly generated and all rigid objects are also compact objects. This derived tensor product with perfect complexes gives a tensor action on the unbounded derived category in the sense of Stevenson. There is a reference to this I can give if anyone wants it. Fortunately, this tensor action actually restricts on the bounded complexes with coherent cohomology. And it's this piece that, in some sense, is the main ingredient that we're going to use to produce our strong generation. For doing so, we need some constructions. So choose two objects inside dB cox. Thick O dot of G denotes the smallest thick subcategory in dB cox closed under the perf action. What this means is that for every E inside thick O dot of G, and for every P in perf X, we have that E O times P sits inside thick O dot. That's what it means to be closed under the perf action. I write E of X to be the derived tensor product of E on the local at the stalk of X, tensored with Kx, where Kx is the cozy complex of the local ring OX on a minimal set of generators. Turns out this Kx is independent of the choice of minimal generators. And we write the support of G to be all points where G has non-vanishing cohomology. Okay, so the outline is as follows. Let X be a noetherian scheme, and let's fix an object G inside dB cox. What we showed is for any E in any point X inside my scheme, E of X being generated by G of X locally implies E sits inside thick O dot G. Again, thick O dot is the smallest thick subcategory of G, which is closed under the perf action. So what this first result says, if locally I can generate EX tensored with the cozy complex of the local ring, that implies I can generate E in the big category as long as my thick subcategory is closed under the perf action. So you can generate as a perf OX module in the terminology of Stevenson. Now, if I can generate locally again the residue field of my structure of the local ring, that means that the smallest thick subcategory closed under the perf action is all of dB cox. So locally, if I can generate the residue fields, that means globally, the smallest thick subcategory closed under the perf action is all of dB cox. And again, this comes from that paper by Stevenson where you have this tensor action, you have this local to global principle, and it relates objects how you can generate locally, in our sense, to how you can view thick subcategories closing the perf action globally. And there's this nice relation, and we're going to make use of that. So as you can see, because I'm using a local global type of argument, we want to say something meaningful locally. So if I take a local noetherian at finite ring and I take a module, I take a bounded complex, dB mod R. If you push forward Km sufficient many times, it's actually equal, it's a quasi-isomorphic to its cohomology. And what Km is the derived tensor product of the cozy complex of the ring tensored with M. And again, I'm not only pushing sufficiently many iterates, but I actually have a bound, and it's going to be P to the E bigger than the codepth of R. This takes some work to do, but what it says is that in our terminology, Km, if I push it forward enough times, it becomes formal in the sense that it's going to be quasi-isomorphic to its cohomology. Now, when Km has non-vanishing cohomology, you can actually say something nice. I can generate the residue field. In fact, it turns out the residue field is a direct summand of the ETH push forward on Km. So for instance, if M is just a module, this would be just some kind of push forward of a complex generated by M, or cones of direct sums from M. So if you go back, this says, all right, if I can generate all the residue fields locally, then thick O dot my object is the whole space. Locally, what we're saying is, well, I take any object, I have a mild condition on its cohomology non-vanishing, I can push forward enough times, and I can actually generate the residue field like I wanted to. And the only things I care about is its codepth and the characteristic I'm working in. So one idea is, well, if I define the codepth as a scheme, can I know it's finite, and it's F finite, and I know the prime characteristic, obviously. Well, can I uniformly use this to produce all residue fields locally with a single object from coming from the global category? That's what we do. So if you fix two objects, choose an E such that P to the E is bigger than the codepth, where P is the characteristic of the F finite scheme. Well, we know one, codepth is finite when my scheme is F finite. If the support of E is in the support of G, that actually tells me that E is inside thick O dot of the ETH push forward on G. And when G has full support, I know something even better. Thick O dot of the ETH push forward is all dB cox. Again, there's proofs obviously right now, but this is the strategy. We're using this tensor action on dB cox when restricted, gives us something nice. Stevenson had these ideas that have local global principles, and we're trying to exploit that. And what we're reducing is the problem about how can I generate the residue fields locally? And do I have enough control on those iterates? And again, we're using this codepth, given that it's finite, to actually have control on the number of iterates needed. So now piecing this together in the same notation, let G be an object that has full support, choose E so large, such that P to E is bigger than the codepth. If I choose any subcategory of perfects that generates perfects, then thick O dot of the ETH push forward is the thick subcategory of this set of the push forwards of all the tensor products of E O times G, where E comes from U. So what this is saying is that, well, if I have an object that generates perf X, I can actually push it forward and know the smallest thick subcategory it generates is all dB cox. Now, this last statement is a proof that uses an observation and the projection formula. And we're using this tensor action, these local global principles. We're kind of gluing these together. But it gives us a way to say, all right, generation can be understood about generating the residue fields locally. If I can generate under the perf action, then somehow can I show that I can generate in the usual sense that we just said above as a classical generator. And the idea is we're going to use these perfect objects and the fact that the Frobenius push forward being F finite, we have some relations between pulling back complex perfect objects, pulling back objects that generate perfect complexes or compact generators rather. And this allows us to actually piece together these tensor actions, the local global principles, and what we know about the codepth locally and how we could push forward objects to produce something that's formal to actually get this strong generation result. And that's exactly what this says here. Well, the object that's pushed forward, classical generator, and strong generation actually comes by invoking the Aoki. So what's interesting is our results produce classical generators. To say it's a strong generator, all you have to do is assume separated. That's coming from the result of Aoki. It might be the case that separated is not needed and we still have strong generators, but we don't know that. It's just an interesting thing that our methods produce classical generators, and it might be, in general, a natural question to ask is, when is it also a strong generator when it's not separated? And that's something that surely should be studied next. And thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Please unmute yourselves and give the speaker a round of applause. Okay, if you have any questions for the speaker, you can ask them now.
Maybe I can ask a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please go ahead, Alexa.
So my question was, do you have any bounds on generation time that your generators give?
So I have examples where I have, for the affine case, bounds. There's some bounds for those examples of f-thick, and then you could produce bounds for those. As a bound in general, no. Not
Maybe just for a fine case.
I have examples where you can produce bounds for it, but in general, at the moment, no. But it is something I'm looking at for sure.
Mm-hmm. And do these bounds look good, like sharp ones, or no?
I don't know personally. I mean, it's
Okay.
hard for me to kind of say.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Alexei, for the question. Do you have any other questions for Pat?
If it's okay, I jump in. Recently, for toric varieties, it was shown that the generation time was equal to the dimension by two groups. So it can be very good in a lot of situations.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Well, in that case, let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you.
So the video of this talk will be uploaded to the YouTube channel of this seminar series soon. Okay, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.